everything.
You see how fast that arrow hit that target? It was almost like you didn't even see it. It was invisible because of the little glitch there in the video. Anyways, hey, I'm Caleb. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's great to have you here. I'm a teaching pastor here, and along with Tyler, we've been walking through the book of Ruth. So before I say anything else, you can start trying to find that in your Bible. It's towards the beginning. A little tiny book between Judges and 1 Samuel, so you can work your way there. We'll be spending most of our time in that passage today. If you don't have a Bible, that's totally okay. It'll be on the screen too. But if you got one, you can open to it. We're in this series right now called Shooting for Average. The significance of trust. And what we're doing is we're taking aim, no pun intended, actually completely intended, and no one laughed. Wow, I tried really hard. We're taking aim at the way we think about ourselves. We're starting off this year, and the very first message of the series was the statement that we are not awesome. We are not awesome. Tyler doubled down on that last week when he said, you never have to worry about becoming insignificant when you realize you already are. I thought that was it twisted a little in my heart. But yeah, it's such a good thing. We really believe that in order for us to live this year ahead, and really even as we're starting a new decade, the way God designed us, we need to be set free from the prison of trying to be significant and instead rest our hearts in who God really created us to be. And we're using the book of Ruth to really look at some very average people who simply trust God. And incredibly significant things are the result of that, not because they're awesome, but because their God is. Yesterday, this is a quick proponent for being outside, but most of my life is lived looking at a computer screen, looking at a phone screen, or a book page, or standing in front of people. See, and in all those worlds, especially those first three that we all have in common, looking at a computer screen, a phone, probably too much looking at a phone, and maybe looking at the pages of a book. Some of you are like, what's a book? It's like a Kindle, but it has paper in it, and it's a Kindle that you can turn like this. It's really weird. But when we spend our life looking at that is a world that is under our control, and we can feel big. We feel bigger than all those parts of our life. And so if you're anything like me, when I spend day after day looking at a computer screen, a phone screen, and a book page, and I just spend day after day like that, I start to feel bigger and bigger. But last night, I was at a bonfire. No one cares. Like, Caleb, why are you telling? No one cares. I was at a bonfire, and I looked up at the sky. And I saw the stars, which is something I don't see a whole lot of in my normal everyday life. Usually at that time in the evening, I'm watching TV or looking at a book page or, honestly, scrolling my phone screen, right? But I looked at the stars. And you know what happens when you look at the stars? You're reminded that you're small. I thought every single one of those stars up there could burn me to nothing like that, right? Every one of those stars, I'm so tiny. If you do a Google Earth search of this area, you will not see Caleb Ives. You will not see me. I've tried. Zoomed in all the way. Didn't see myself, all right? You will not see me. I am small. And there's something about getting out in creation and looking at what God has made instead of what man has made and say, wow, that's a good reminder. I'm small. I'm really insignificant in the scope of things. And I believe, that what the Bible teaches us is that living in that perspective will set our hearts free from so much of the anxiety and fear and striving that our culture is driven by. So we're going to continue in that series today. We're going to meet our third character in the story of Ruth. But I want to pray real quick here for my sake, and then you can join along if you want. If not, you can just scroll your phone screen while I pray, okay? Let me pray. God, I need you. I need you. There is not one thing I can say in my own strength that will impact anyone here. God, the only thing that will change our hearts is you and what you have to say. So God, get me out of your way. I just ask that you would breathe upon this text, bring it alive. God, bring truth to our hearts and change us. So when we leave here today, we'd be different in the way we understand you and the way we understand ourselves in relationship to our world. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so we're jumping into Ruth. We're going to start with verse 22 of chapter 1 and move into the second chapter. And if you've been with us the first 2 weeks, you know where we're at in the story. If not, check it out online, and I'm not going to fill you in now. But 122 picks up our story. Naomi and Ruth are headed back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. All right, Ruth has left everything. She's trusted this God that she didn't know until she met Naomi and her son. She's now lost everything, and she had two options: rely upon herself and go back to her family and try to get a husband, or follow and trust this God to unknown outcomes. And she chose to trust God. Now 122 shows us what happens. It says this: So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by her daughter-in-law Ruth, the young Moabite woman. They arrived in Bethlehem in late spring at the beginning of the barley harvest. That's going to be important in a minute, but just hang on. Now, there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So here's our introductory statement the author gives us. So the author of the book of Ruth says, hey, I want you to meet Boaz. He is a wealthy and influential man. Now, when you hear those words, instantly what we're set up to say is, wait a minute, this guy's situation in life is vastly different from the first two main players in this story, Naomi and Ruth. See, we have an elderly widow who has no children. She is destitute, poor, and trapped in that. And we have a Moabite foreigner who's a widow, who's childless as well. They are at the bottom of the mountain in every status category you can imagine. And then now we have Boaz. And Boaz, with those words, wealthy and influential, it lets us know that in every one of those status categories, he's at the top of the mountain. He's wealthy. So economically and socially, he's at the top. Influential, politically, every way you want to be valuable to your society, he is. He's at the top of the mountain. They're at the bottom. And that's intentionally set up in this book. And I think that's good because you know what the church is made up of? The whole spectrum as well. Our church is made up of that. People who maybe society would say is at the top of the mountain, and some of us, we have moments where we feel we're at the very bottom. And this book, just like the entire Bible, is written to all of us. And it's a God who interacts with all of us where we're at. And what we're going to see happen now is an interaction for the rest of this chapter between Boaz and Ruth at the time of the barley harvest. Now, I bet you when you got here today, you didn't think, you know what I'm going to underline in my Bible? The phrase barley harvest. Right? No, he's like, oh, it's really transformational. It's powerful. What'd you get out of church today? You know what? God really spoke to me. Barley harvest. You know? No one's like, what are you talking about? But here's why I want you to notice that. I want to highlight it on the screen. It actually helps to create a context for what we're going to see happen here in this story. See, God had given laws to his people. And the first 5 books of the Bible, there's a lot of those, specifically in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. There's a lot of instructions given by God to his community, which is called Israel. And those instructions are really for 2 reasons. One is that they would know how he wants them to live, and so that the world, through them, would see what their God is like. Okay? And so there's all these laws given, and one category of those laws is about how the Israelites are supposed to do harvest. So in Deuteronomy 24, here's a passage here that highlights this. And this is in the law from Moses is writing it down for the Israelites to have. When you are harvesting your crops and forget to bring in a bundle of grain from your field, don't go back to it. Leave it for the foreigners, orphans, and widows. Then the Lord your God will bless you in all you do. And I think this is important. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. That is why I'm giving you this command. In Leviticus 19, you can write that down if you want to look at it later, verses 9 and 10. There's more of the instructions on how they're to do harvest. It says, hey, when you go out to do the harvest, and remember, they're not running a combine. They all got a team of harvesters that work for the wealthy landowner, and they go out and they gather up bundles and they carry them, right? So some of those will get dropped. But it also says when you harvest, don't go right to the very edge of the property, but leave the edges of the property for the poor and the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, those that have need. Be kind to them. And you could say this is a law of kindness that God gives his community. God gives this to his people about how they're to do harvest. And that is what we're going to see Ruth and Boaz interacting around, is this law. But before we get into that, there was a warning in Deuteronomy as well, in Deuteronomy chapter 8, that God gives his people. He says, listen, you've been living in a wilderness, right? You've been walking through this Sinai wilderness, getting bread dropped out of heaven. You were relying on God every day. You had to have him or you died. But you're going to have a different kind of life in this new land. When you get there, you're going to have farmland, you're going to have crops grow, you're going to have a sturdy home made of stone instead of living in tents through the wilderness. You're going to have security, you're going to prosper, and when you do, there's a problem that might happen. There's a problem that might happen. And here's what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 11 through 14. That is the time to be careful. Beware that in your plenty you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands. For when you've become full and prosperous and have built fine homes to live in, and when your flocks and herds have become very large and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time and forget the Lord your God who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. He says, listen, things are going to get better for you. And you're going to have, as time progresses, there's some things in life that are going to get better. Your status in this world might elevate. You might get more secure financially. And when that does, there's a tendency of the human heart to drift from the Lord, to drift from trusting in him and relying on him. But he says, listen, when that happens, don't forget that your story is still the same. You are in relationship with me, with God, because I rescued you from your slavery and made you my kids. Never forget that. But it acknowledges that drift. And at the time of Judges, the time of the book of Ruth, that's exactly what has happened. People like Boaz, are wealthy and influential, have stopped trusting in God and turned their hearts away from obedience to him. And I think there's something we can all see out of that. And it's this statement. And you can, if you've got your program with you, you can open that up and you'll see there's some notes in there to fill in some blanks. And when I think I am awesome, I won't trust God because I don't think I need him. When I think I'm awesome, when I think, look what I've done for myself, I won't trust God anymore because I don't think I need him. When we're living a life like the Israelites had in the wilderness, and literally, if bread doesn't fall out of heaven, you're going to starve. You know you need God, right? And we've all been in those places, in those seasons where it's like, if God doesn't show up today, I'm toast. I'm done for, right? In those times, we trust him. But there's also seasons of life where we don't feel the urgency of our need for God. And that need becomes muted by the sense of security that we begin to trust in. So when I think I am awesome, I won't trust God because I don't think I need him. I don't think I need him. And here's the reality. He reminds them of Egypt and says, listen, there will never be a moment you don't need me. There'll just be moments you don't feel like you do. But when you stop realizing you need God, we will stop trusting in him. And we start to rely on self instead of depending on God. And the warning there is that in the scriptures is that leads to the time of the judges, which is a time of chaos and pain and anguish for them and for the people around them. But let's pick up the story. But this barley harvest and these laws of harvest, this law of kindness to the poor, that's what's at play when we see Ruth say this in chapter 2, verse 2 of Ruth. So one day, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it. So Ruth says to Naomi, look, we have nothing in the cupboard. We traveled back here. We have no security. We're poor. But there is this God that I'm trusting in. He told the people this law of kindness. So I'm going to go out. Let me go out and see if I can find someone who is kind. Now that word kind there, I just want to highlight what it means. It's not in your notes, but you can jot this down if you want. That word kindness isn't like, hey kids, stop punching your sibling. Be nice, right? That's not what we're talking about here. That word kindness comes from a Hebrew word, the Hebrew word for grace. And what it means is, let me see if I can find someone who will be kind to me before they know if I deserve it. Right? Being kind to someone before they deserve it, or even if they don't. That's the kind of kindness that Ruth is looking for here. I'm an outsider. I'm a foreigner. I'm a widow. I'm poor. I'm relying on someone who will show the law of kindness, even if I don't seem like I deserve it. And so she goes out and she just happens to find her way to the field of Boaz, looking for someone of kindness. She goes out to the field, and she ends up in the field of this wealthy man named Boaz. Now, he's not there at the time. She asked the labor team that's there, the harvesters, hey, can I gather some of the remnants? And they allow her to. Then Boaz comes out to check on his workers, and verse 5 picks up their interaction. Boaz asks his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? And the foreman replied, she's the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She's been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. And just pause there for a second. A lot of times this story, if you've ever heard of Ruth, you may have heard it set as like this real story of romance. Now, that can mislead us regarding what happens right here. The language of this text shows us that Boaz wasn't like, wow, she's fine, that girl over there gathering that grain, and I'm thinking about trying to take her out on a date, so let me holler at her real quick, all right? That's not what we got going on. In fact, he says, by saying, who is that young woman? He's literally saying at the time, and he's going to mention later, there's young men around. He's thinking to himself, like, who is that young woman, right? Because typically in that culture, if you were a man, you would have been working, right? But it's the young woman who would be out there gathering. She's poor, she's destitute. He knows that must be true of her. So he's saying, what family is she a part of? How is she here? Why is she here? And then when he comes to her and he says to her, not, hey girl, hey, he says, daughter, right? He says to her, daughter, listen, my daughter, stay right with us. That language of daughter also communicates. He's probably older than her, probably doesn't think like, oh, here's a potential wife, but what he's using is language that creates a sense of safety and belonging. You're going to see in the New Testament, Jesus is going to have like a woman with an issue of blood who falls down at his feet and it has been rejected by everyone else, and he's going to say daughter to her. That word throughout the Bible is used to create a sense of safety and belonging for a person. So Boaz says to her, Ruth, you're safe and you're welcome to be here. It's not a romance moment. It's the law of kindness being lived out by someone who's wealthy and influential, but is still trusting God enough to obey him in the next and right thing. It continues on and says, stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they're harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well. Now, I want to go back to that law idea, right? Even though this passage shows Boaz interacting with Ruth, what it's really about is the way Boaz interacts with God. Because there's a law that he's to be kind to people like Ruth and make sure they have the grain and that they can gather there. But the decision is whether or not he's going to trust God or rely on himself. And what we see happen is that Boaz defines himself more by his relationship with God than he does his status in the world. See, he remembers that he's really an average person who's loved by God, and he walks in faithfulness to God and doesn't allow his status to move him away from trusting his God. Now, there might be a little backstory reason why Boaz, in a time where everyone else was forgetting God, remembered his own need and reliance upon God. See, Boaz's mom, it's not here in this story, but Boaz's mom was a lady named Rahab. And Rahab was a Canaanite lady. You can read about her in Joshua chapter 2 and chapter 6. We get to know her. See, Boaz's mom, Rahab, she's a Canaanite woman, which means she's an enemy. She's an outsider. She's not an Israelite. She's an enemy to the Israelites. From an enemy tribe, she's living in a city of Jericho that's at war with the people of Israel. Now, not only is she an enemy and an outsider, but she is a sinful outsider. She's a prostitute who's practicing a way of life that wasn't how God designed it to be working. And she's living as a prostitute, Canaanite woman who's an enemy outsider to the Israelites. But that woman heard about God and trusted in him. And when she trusted in God, what had happened for Boaz's mom is that she had no longer then been seen as a sinful outsider enemy, but was welcomed as yet another one who trusts God and therefore is a part of the family. A part of the family. Now, I have to imagine that through Boaz's childhood and adolescence and as he got older, I don't know if his mom's still alive at the time of this book, but that he'd heard many times his mom say, hey, this is why we're a part of this family. This is why we're in relationship with this God, because he is kind. He is gracious. We would never be here if it wasn't for God and his community being kind and being gracious and welcoming us in. There's incredible similarities to what Boaz is seeing now. An outsider, despised woman. Do I welcome her or not? So Boaz trusts God and walks in obedience in this law of kindness. So here's Boaz's perspective, and you can write this down. Even though his status has changed, even though he's wealthy and influential, he's at the top of the mountain, his perspective is this: I am an average person loved by God, therefore I trust him. I'm an average person loved by God, therefore I trust him. My occupation doesn't define me. My wealth doesn't define me. My status doesn't define me. I am defined as one who trusts in the God who loves me. And that's the challenge of this book. And I'll just say this. A lot of times we think the Bible's full of these big heroic moments. Boaz isn't doing something heroic, like he's not making the big decision of his life. He's just doing that day's obedient act of trust. Like for the day before, it was something else. But that day, it was, hey, look, there's a woman here who's in need. My God has asked me to be kind to her. So you know what? I'm going to trust God enough to not try to store up all my wealth for myself. I'm going to let her have what she needs, and I'm going to make her feel welcome here. Just that day's act of trust. Had no idea that from that woman would come the greatest king of Israel, David. From that woman would come the forever king of the earth, Jesus. Had no idea the significance of that moment, but just knew he trusted his God enough to do the next and right thing. That's the same call in our lives as well. So what we see happen now, and we're just going to look at a few more verses as we'll move towards an end soon. But in verses 10 through 12, what we're going to see happen is not only is Boaz's definition and view of himself defined by his relationship with God, but his view of Ruth is defined by that as well. Look what she says in verses 10 through 12. Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. What have I done to deserve such kindness, she asked. I'm only a foreigner. Listen, this is a real story. This is a real woman, and feel the emotions of her as well, where she's like, hey, I lost my husband. I had no kids. I have no prospects of a future ahead. We have no food. Naomi's back at wherever we're staying, just hoping that I'll come back with a meal, and I've been welcomed here. I've been welcomed here. Well, he must not know my status. He must not know. And so she says, well, what have I done to deserve this? I'm only a foreigner. What she's saying is everyone else defines me by this, by my ethnic background. Everyone else defines me by my social class, by whatever it is. But that's not how Boaz responds. He says, yes, I know that. But I also know about everything you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I've heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, may he reward you fully for what you have done. You see, Ruth says, I'm different than you. I'm low in my status. I'm below average, and you're above average. And he says, no. You're one who trusts in this same God. Guess what? We're the same. Yeah, our culture, the world around us might define us as here and here, but guess what? We're both right here. I'm not a somebody and you're nobody. We're both everybody. And anybody who is loved by God, an average person loved by God because we trust in him. And what we see in this interaction and the way he views Ruth is that when I view myself from God's perspective, it's much easier for me to do the same for others. See, if Boaz defined himself by his economic class, by his influential position in culture, then he would have defined Ruth the same way. But the fact that he said, no, whatever that looks like, I'm really defined as one of God's kids, then he was able to look at someone who was at the bottom of the mountain and say, no, we're the same. You trust God? Welcome to the family. You trust God? I don't see you define you by your status. I define you by God's love for you. I know God. It welcomes you to take refuge in him. So I agree with God. I agree with God's view of you. You know, Boaz has this position, right, in culture. And there's a reason I bring it up. In reality, here in our culture, all of us are rich in the global scope of things. Basically, all of us are rich and none of us feel like we are. That's kind of tends to be how it operates here in the U.S. But there's for some of us in here, and we've experienced great opportunity of wealth and influence, and we can fall for the same thing the Israelites were falling for and start to rely on ourselves. But Boaz doesn't do that. He isn't defined by that. In fact, when he says, look, my identity in life, well, my status is irrelevant to that. My identity and my way of living, my significance to the culture around me, it's irrelevant to that. The only thing that matters is I am a person in relationship with God because he was gracious to me. I'm a person in relationship with God because he welcomed me in mercy. Therefore, I trust him. But this isn't exclusive to Boaz alone. This idea of a life defined by relationship with God and not by anything else, that's not exclusive to Boaz. In fact, throughout the New Testament, as these communities of people start to believe in Jesus, groups like us, in every city along the Roman Empire, which was the world of that time, there's groups of people who are from different ethnic backgrounds, they're different social classes, from the wealthiest landowner in town to the lowest servant in one of the households. From political leaders and military members to former rebels, like all categories, different political backgrounds, different political opinion, all these perspectives. But the New Testament writers say, hey, it's just like Boaz. You know what? That stuff is irrelevant when it comes to your real identity and the way you're called to live. You are defined collectively as children of God. So be a family. Be a family. Don't allow your culture to define you. Allow God to define who you are. Allow him to define you as a child of God. And here's the basic statement of the New Testament and of the entire Bible is this: it is better to trust in our relationship with God than our status in the world. It is better to trust in our relationship with God than our status in the world. Why? Because your status in the world's going to change, maybe tomorrow. We might walk into our work tomorrow and our status changed and we don't even know it's going to happen yet. By the end of this year, my significance in my community might change. We could be at the top and then we can go to the bottom. It can happen. So it's insecure to live our life trusting in our status in this world. That's insecure. It's better to trust in our relationship with God because that is a place of security. Here's what Paul says in Galatians. He's talking to people all across the spectrum, a diverse group of people who have one thing in common: they trust in Jesus. And here's what he says: for you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus. And all who have been united with Christ in baptism have put on the character of Christ, like putting on new clothes. There's no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. What he's saying is, look, you still are those things, but it doesn't define you. What defines you is what God has said about you, not what others call you. What defines you is what God has said about you, that you are a child of God. Ephesians 2. A lot of people, just like Ruth, are reading Ephesians 2. They thought of themselves as outsiders from God's family. But Paul says, hey, if you trusted in Jesus, listen to this. So now you are no longer strangers and foreigners. You are citizens along with all of God's holy people. You are members of God's family. River Run, my brothers, my sisters, you are beloved children of God. God calls you his child, and he invites you to know him as your father. My desire, my heart for us is that we would get set free from the captivity, the bondage of trying to be significant with our life. We're going to sing a song here in just a moment. The band's going to lead us in a song about the Father's heart for us. And as we do that, I want to challenge you, don't just to sit where you're at and let this truth wash over you. Let God pull your heart. It comes to the end of this song and it says this: your arms enfold me until I am only a child of God. There is a drift wired into our human being. A drift from knowing God as Father to starting to know ourselves as significant. A drift from, oh yeah, I knew God as Father when my relationship with him began, but now I kind of define myself as a slave. I define myself as a performer. I define myself as excelling or trying to be successful. But in this moment, what I want to challenge us to do, and my prayer for us as a family is this, that as we walk through this year, as we walk out our lives as a community, we would no longer be striving for significance, but we would rest in our value as beloved children of God. There is never a title you will ever accomplish in your life or gain in your life that will give you more value than this. The God of the universe calls you beloved. The God of the universe calls you his child. As we sing this song, let's let God keep working that into our hearts, that we would rest our hearts in his love for us.